I reject you, Fenrath Greymore, for every woman you ever silenced!
Now, before this story begins, understand something. This is not a love story. This is not a tale where the broken she-wolf forgives the monster and melts into his arms beneath a blood moon. No, this is the story of how a kingdom watched its tyrant choke on the very silence he had fed to others for decades. And if you think you know how it ends, you don't. Not even close. Now, let us begin at the end. The snow fell like ash over the tribunal square of Valdrek, a kingdom carved into the spine of the Ironmaw Mountains, where winter never truly left and mercy had been outlawed long before the first frost. Hundreds of wolves, in skin and fur alike, had gathered in the open courtyard for what was meant to be a ceremony of bonding the sacred mating declaration of Alpha King Fenrath Greymore, sovereign of the Six Packs, warden of the Northern Howl, and the most feared wolf to draw breath in 300 years. He stood on the raised stone dais at the center of the square, draped in a black fur cloak, stitched with the silver crests of every pack he had conquered. His jaw was carved granite. His eyes, the color of a bruise left too long, swept the crowd with the lazy entitlement of a predator who had never once been denied. Behind him, his war council stood in a rigid line. 12 betas, each one tall enough to block the sun, and loyal enough to murder children if he whispered the command. The dais itself told a story. It was old stone, older than Valdrek, older than the Greymore bloodline, older than the concept of alphas and omegas, and the hierarchies wolves had invented to make brutality feel like biology. It had been a gathering place once, centuries ago, where wolves met as equals to settle disputes with words. Fenrath had repurposed it. He had carved his family crest into the surface and stained the stone dark with the blood of his enemies, so that every wolf who climbed those steps would feel the dead beneath their feet. He called it tradition. It was theater. The crowd filled the square from wall to wall, hundreds of wolves pressed shoulder to shoulder, their breath making a low fog that hung at chest height. Some had traveled 3 days to be here. Attendance was not optional. When the Alpha King summoned, you came. The last settlement that had failed to send representatives had been burned to the foundation stones, its people scattered to neighboring packs as laborers. That had been 4 years ago. No one had missed a summoning since. In front of him, forced to her knees in the snow, was a woman. Her name was Ithera. She was no one. That was the point. Fenrath did not choose mates. He collected them. And Ithera, small-boned, amber-eyed, with hair the color of rust, and a rank so low, most wolves in the square had never heard. Her name was his latest acquisition. An omega from the Ashenmere pack, a settlement so poor that its wolves ate bark soup in winter and buried their dead without markers. The crowd knew the ritual. They had seen it before, many times. Fenrath would call a woman forward. He would declare her his chosen. The woman would weep, sometimes with what appeared to be joy, sometimes with what was clearly terror. And then Fenrath would mark her publicly, sinking his teeth into her neck in front of the kingdom to brand her as his. It was not a mating, it was an ownership ceremony. And every woman who had stood where Ithera now knelt had eventually disappeared. Let that settle. Every single one. 7 women in 12 years, declared, marked, and then gone. No funerals, no explanations, just a quiet erasure, as if they had been chalk on a wet stone. The kingdom knew. Nobody spoke. Because the last wolf who had questioned the fate of Fenrath's second mate, a healer named Bryn, had his tongue cut out and was staked at the southern border as a warning to gossips. He was still alive when the crows came, so the crowd stood in the cold and said nothing. They always said nothing. Rise, Fenrath commanded. Ithera did not move. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The betas stiffened. Fenrath's left eye twitched, the only crack in his composure, though those closest to him knew that twitch. It preceded violence the way thunder preceded lightning. I said, "Rise, Omega." Still, she did not move. Her hands were flat on the snow. Her head was bowed. From a distance, she looked like she was praying. But those close enough to see her face, truly see it, noticed something that made their blood stall. She was smiling. Not a broken smile. Not a resigned smile. The kind of smile that only appears on the face of someone who has already accepted the cost of what they are about to do. Then, Ithara stood. Slowly. Not with the trembling obedience of a summoned Omega, but with the deliberate, unhurried calm of someone who has rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in the dark. She turned to face the crowd first. Not the king, the crowd. And what she did next would be told and retold in every wolf territory for the next century. She looked at them, the hundreds of wolves who had come to watch another woman be devoured by tradition, and she said in a voice that did not shake, did not waver, did not beg, "I see you, all of you, and I know the names of every woman who stood here before me." The silence that followed was not the silence of a crowd. It was the silence of a grave being dug. Then she turned, and she looked Fenrath Greymore, Alpha King, Tyrant, Destroyer of Seven, directly in the eye. No one looked the Alpha King in the eye. Ever. It was a challenge. It was a death sentence. Even his betas kept their gazes at his chin. Ithra did not flinch. "I reject you," she said. The words landed like an axe on a chopping block. "I reject you for Meren, who was 17 when you marked her and 19 when she vanished." Fenrath's face went white. "I reject you for Bryn, the healer who tried to run and was dragged back by her hair through the market square, while this kingdom watched and did nothing." His claws extended. He hadn't shifted, but his hands were no longer human. The betas behind him exchanged glances, not of concern for their king, but of something far more dangerous. Recognition. They recognized what was happening. A wolf was speaking to power, and power did not know what to do with words it could not swallow. "I reject you for Solen, who begged your beta to kill her quickly, and he didn't. Who spent 3 days in that cellar before the cold took what your cruelty started." A sound came from the crowd. Not a gasp, not a whisper. A groan, low, collective, involuntary, the sound a body makes when a wound that has been numbed for years suddenly regains feeling. A woman in the crowd let out a sob. Someone else whispered, "Moon have mercy." "I reject you for Anakin, and for Darva, and for Liel, and for the one whose name you erased so completely that even the record keepers call her the Seventh." She stepped closer to him. Closer. Until his shadow swallowed her entirely, and the steam of his breath hit her face. "I reject you for every woman you ever silenced, and I do it with their voices, not mine." Now, here is where the story should end, right? The brave Omega makes her speech. The tyrant kills her. A sad song is written. Scrolls are burned. The world forgets. No. What happened next is why you are still reading. Fenrath did not roar. He did not bellow or snarl or pound his chest. What he did was far worse. He laughed. It was a small laugh. Quiet. The kind of sound a cat makes when it catches a mouse and decides not to kill it yet, not because of mercy, but because the suffering is the meal. "You memorized names," he said. "How charming. Did you practice in front of a puddle?" He turned to his war council. "She thinks courage is a speech." He looked back at Ithara. "Courage, little wolf, is what keeps you breathing after I decide to stop being amused." He raised one clawed hand. The signal. "Take her head. Here. Now. Let the crowd watch." And when it's done, throw the body outside the walls for the wild wolves. Don't waste wood on a pyre. Two betas moved forward instantly. Tormund, a wall of scarred muscle with dead eyes, and Voss, younger but crueler, the one the lower packs called the butcher's dog. They seized Ithra by the arms, forced her back to her knees, and Voss drew a long, curved blade, the kind used for executions, weighted at the tip so the swing would not need a second stroke. The crowd pressed backward. Some covered their children's eyes. Others simply looked down at the snow, as they had always done, as they had been trained to do. And Ithara, kneeling, held, the blade catching the gray winter light, began to laugh. Not hysterically, not with madness. She laughed the way someone laughs when they finally see the punchline to a joke that has taken their entire life to understand. "What do you think happens?" she said, loud enough for the square to hear. "When you kill the last one, Fenrath? When there are no more women willing to kneel? Do you think the moon goddess simply makes more?" "Silence her," Fenrath snapped. Voss raised the blade, and the ground cracked. Not metaphorically. The stone beneath Ithra's knees split a fissure that raced from her body outward in jagged lines, like a frozen lake shattering under sudden weight. The crack traveled through the snow, through the square, up the steps of the dais, and stopped perfectly, impossibly at Fenrath's boots. The crowd scrambled. Wolves shifted instinctively, their fur bristling against the cold as bodies twisted and bones snapped into new shapes. But this was not an attack they could fight. This was not a rival pack. This was something older. Ithara's eyes, which had been amber her entire life, the dull, unremarkable amber of a low-ranking Omega, turned white. Not the white of blindness, the white of a sky before a storm. Luminous, total, as if something vast had opened its eyes behind hers. The temperature in the square dropped 10 degrees in a single breath. Wolves who had shifted back to human form felt their skin prickle, felt their wolves stir inside them not in aggression, but in deference. Something ancient was moving through the square, something that predated alpha bloodlines and pack hierarchies, and every structure that wolves had built to convince themselves they were more than animals with politics. She stood. Tormund and Voss, who had been gripping her arms, were thrown backward not by force, but by heat. Their palms were blistered, the skin bubbling as if they had grabbed a forge iron. Tormund stared at his ruined hands with the blank incomprehension of a man whose body has betrayed his certainty. Voss simply screamed. Fenrath took a step back. The first step back he had taken in his life. "What is this?" "This," Ithara said, and her voice was no longer singular. It was layered 7 voices beneath her own, each one distinct, each one a frequency of grief turned to iron. "This is what happens when you kill women who pray." Now let us pause here, because if this were a simple revenge story, Ithra would shift into some magnificent, impossibly powerful wolf and rip Fenrath apart in front of his kingdom. That would be satisfying, brief, and ultimately forgettable. What Ithra did instead was so much worse. She didn't shift. She didn't attack. She didn't need to. She cursed him. Not with dark magic, not with forbidden blood rites or necromancy or any of the old horrors. She cursed him with truth, the most dangerous weapon any wolf can wield against a tyrant. "Fenrath Greymore," she said, and her white eyes locked onto his with the weight of a closing coffin lid. "I do not curse you to die. I curse you to be known." She raised her hand, and from the cracked ground, mist rose, not fog, not vapor, but memory made visible. It swirled around the square like smoke in a glass jar, and within it, images formed, clear as reflections in still water. The crowd saw Maren, young, dark-haired, beautiful, being dragged into Fenrath's private chambers. They heard her screams. They watched Fenrath lock the door from the inside. They saw what the morning looked like after the bruises on her arms shaped like fingers, the way she stopped speaking for 2 weeks, the way the healers were told to say she had fallen. They saw Bryn, the healer, running through a winter forest at night, barefoot, bleeding from a wound at her temple. They watched Fenrath's beta catch her by the ankle. They watched what happened next, and many in the crowd turned away, retching into the snow. But the mist did not care about their comfort. It held the image steady and merciless, until even those who looked away could see it behind their closed eyelids. They saw Solin, hanging from a rafter in a storage cellar, and the guards who found her cutting the rope and burning it so there would be no evidence. They saw the report that was written afterward, natural causes, and the healer who signed it with shaking hands because he knew what would happen to his family if he wrote the truth. They saw Anakin, Darva, Liel, one by one, each memory more unbearable than the last, each truth a blade that the kingdom had spent years pretending did not exist. And they saw the seventh, the one without a name, a girl so young that several wolves in the crowd fell to their knees and howled in anguish. Not a war howl, a mourning howl. The kind that wolves release when something has been broken that can never be repaired. Fenrath stood on his dais, watching his kingdom see what he truly was. And for the first time in his reign, the mask cracked. "Stop this!" he screamed, and his voice was not the voice of a king. It was the voice of a cornered animal. "I command you to stop!" But Ithera was not his to command. She had never been his to command. None of them had. What does a tyrant do when his own people see his face without the crown? When the mythology he has built brick by bloody brick collapses in the time it takes for mist to rise from broken ground, he runs. No. First, he tries to kill. That is always the first instinct. Fenrath shifted his body, tearing from human to wolf in a surge of black fur and bone-white teeth, a beast so massive that his shadow alone had once made entire packs surrender. He lunged for Ithera, and hit nothing. She was standing right there. He passed through her, or rather around her, his body redirecting itself mid-leap, as though some invisible hand had simply moved him aside. He crashed into the snow, scrambled to his feet, and lunged again. Same result. A third time. A fourth. He could not touch her. The seven voices spoke through Ithera again. "You cannot kill what you have already killed, Fenrath. We are beyond your teeth." Now the betas were uncertain. Tormund looked at Voss. Voss looked at the crowd. The crowd was no longer silent. It began as a murmur, then a name. Marin. Someone said it. Then another voice, Bryn, and another, Solène. The names passed through the crowd like wind through wheat, each one spoken louder than the last, until the tribunal square, the same square where 7 women had been claimed and erased, rang with their names like a bell struck 7 times. "Silence!" Fenrath roared, back in his human form, naked from the shift, snow plastering to his skin. He looked wild, diminished. "A king without clothes is not a metaphor, it is a verdict. I am your alpha. I am your king." An old woman near the front of the crowd, a grandmother, white-haired, with the bent spine of a life spent working, stepped forward. She was no one. A laundrywoman from the Eastern Quarter. Her name was Moth, and she had washed blood from Fenrath's sheets more times than she could count. She looked at him. She did not bow. "You are a murderer," she said, simply, as though observing the weather. And that not Ithera's rejection, not the cracking ground, not the ghostly visions that was the moment the kingdom of Valdrek changed. Because when one ordinary person says the truth out loud, it gives permission to every other ordinary person to do the same. Murderer. The words spread, whispered at first, then spoken, then shouted. Wolves, who had spent their lives in submission omegas, low-ranked betas, craftspeople, farmers, mothers, elders opened their mouths for the first time and spoke the word that had been rotting behind their teeth for years. Fenrath's 12 betas looked at each other. A calculation was happening behind their eyes, the cold, practical arithmetic of loyalty. A king is only a king so long as enough wolves are willing to die for him, and in that moment, not one of them was willing to die for Fenrath Greymore. The first to move was Grail, the oldest of the 12, the one who had served the longest, the one Fenrath had once called my shadow. Grail looked at the Alpha King. He looked at the crowd. He looked at Ithera, this impossible Omega who had done what no army, no rival pack, no assassination attempt had ever managed. And then Grail did something he had not done in 23 years of service. He turned his back on the Alpha. The gesture was so shocking, so total in its disrespect, that 2 wolves in the front row physically flinched. In wolf culture, turning your back on your alpha was not simply disobedience, it was erasure. It said, "You are not dangerous enough to watch." 6 more betas followed Grail off the dais, 7 total. They stepped down into the crowd, and the crowd parted for them, and then closed around them, absorbing them back into the body of the pack, like white blood cells reclaiming what had been stolen. The remaining 5, Tormund, Voss, and 3 others hesitated. Their loyalty was not to the man, it was to the power, and the power was shifting, visibly, like sand being pulled by a tide. Fenrath saw it. He saw all of it. And he made the choice that every tyrant eventually makes when the throne cracks beneath them. He ran. He shifted again, that massive black wolf, and bolted from the square, through the stone archway that led to the northern forest, into the trees, into the snow, into the howling white wilderness beyond the kingdom walls. He ran, and no one chased him. That was the cruelest part. No one thought he was worth chasing. Here is where you might expect the story to resolve. The tyrant fled. The Omega proved her power. The kingdom is free. Roll the credits. But you forgot something. Ithera said she cursed him to be known. She did not say she cursed him to escape. 3 days passed after Fenrath's flight. 3 days in which the kingdom of Valdrek underwent a transformation that would have taken years under normal circumstances. The remaining betas, those who had stepped off the dais, convened a council. For the first time in the kingdom's history, Omegas were permitted to speak at a governing assembly. Moth, the old laundry woman, was given a chair at the table because the wolves of Valdrek decided that someone who had been invisible for 60 years had probably seen more than anyone. Ithera did not join the council. She walked north, alone, into the forest where Fenrath had fled. "You're going after him," said Grail, one of the defected betas, a broad-shouldered wolf with a deep scar across his nose, who had once been Fenrath's hunting companion. He had found her at the northern gate, packing nothing but a thin cloak and a waterskin. "He'll kill you. Whatever happened in the square that power, it might not come twice." Ithera looked at him with those amber eyes. They were amber again. Normal. No white glow. No layered voices. She looked again like exactly what she was, a small, underfed Omega from the poorest settlement in the territory. "The women who lent me their voices," she said, "they did not lend me their strength. They lent me their witness. What I do now, I do as myself." "Then why go?" She was quiet for a moment. The snow was falling again, heavy, wet flakes that melted on contact with skin. "Because a wolf who runs from his crimes does not stop being a criminal. He just becomes a criminal with distance. And distance, eventually, becomes a new kingdom." Grail understood. If Fenrath survived, if he reached another territory, built new alliances, raised a new army, he would return. Tyrants always return. History is a wheel, and the axle is the memory of men, which is short, and the ambition of monsters, which is long. Let me come with you, Grail said. No, you'll die alone in that forest. Maybe, but I won't die silent, and that's already more than he allowed the others. She left through the northern gate. The guards who had been Fenrath's men 3 days prior, and were now simply men, watched her go. One of them, a young wolf, barely out of his adolescence, whispered to his companion, "Who is she?" His companion, older, wiser, with the tired eyes of someone who had seen too much, replied, "Someone who should have existed a long time ago." The northern forest of Valdrek was not a kind place. It was old-growth timber, black pine, and iron oak with a canopy so thick that even midday felt like dusk. The snow here was not the picturesque powder of the kingdom square. It was deep, crusted, treacherous. It hid ravines. It muffled sound. It swallowed footprints within the hour. This was the place where Valdrek sent its exiles not as a mercy, but as a death sentence the kingdom did not have to watch. Ithra tracked Fenrath not by scent. He had been smart enough to cross water multiple times and roll in pine sap to mask himself, but by destruction. A broken branch here, claw marks on a trunk there, and scattered between these markers, smaller signs that told a more intimate story. Patches of fur caught on thorns where he had shifted mid-stride, unable to control the change. Blood on a rock where he had slammed his fist or paw against stone for no strategic reason. The trail of a wolf unraveling. And, on the second day, a deer carcass torn apart with such excessive violence that the snow around it was more red than white. The deer had been a doe pregnant, by the size of her belly. Fenrath had not eaten much of her. He had simply destroyed her. There was no other word for it. He was losing control. She could see it in the wounds on the deer, not the clean, efficient kill of a predator feeding, but the frantic mauling of a wolf, trying to destroy something he could not name. He was eating his own rage, and rage, unlike food, does not sustain. It hollows. That night, Ithra made no fire. She curled into a hollow beneath the roots of an overturned oak, wrapped her thin cloak around herself, and slept the way she had always slept in Ashenmere lightly, with one ear open, ready to wake at the first wrong sound. The cold was brutal. It crept into her joints and turned her fingers stiff. But cold was an old companion. Ithra had been cold her entire life. What was one more night? On the third day of her tracking, she found his first message. Carved into the trunk of an ancient oak, using claws, deep enough that the pale wood showed through the bark. "Come closer, and I'll make you the 8th." Ithara studied the carving. She pressed her fingers into the grooves. Then she walked on. The second message came hours later, scratched into a frozen riverbank. "I am still your king." The third message was not carved. It was howled a long, ragged, broken sound that echoed through the forest and sent every bird within a mile into panicked flight. It was not a war howl. It was not a declaration. It was the sound of a wolf who had begun to realize that the forest did not know his name, and the trees did not bow, and the snow did not care about his title. Ithra followed the sound. She found him at dusk on the 4th day, in a clearing where the canopy broke open and the gray sky poured cold light down like water. He was in his human form, naked, filthy, his body covered in self-inflicted scratches where he had shifted and unshifted so many times that his skin could not decide what it was. His lips were blue. His eyes, those bruise-colored eyes that had terrified a kingdom, were glassy, unfocused, darting. He was talking to someone who was not there. "Told you to stay in the cellar. I told you, but you had to scream. You always screamed. Why did you always?" He stopped. He saw her. The transformation was instant. The glaze left his eyes. His spine straightened, his lip curled. For a moment, just a moment, he was Fenrath Greymore again. Alpha King. Tyrant. The wolf who made the world kneel. You, he said. Me, Ithara agreed. You followed me. He laughed. It was a cracked, rattling sound, like stones in a dry riverbed. The little Omega followed the wolf into the woods. Do you know what happens in the stories when the lamb follows the wolf? The stories were written by wolves, Ithara said. I'm not interested in their version. He lunged. This time, there was no supernatural force to redirect him. No ghostly barrier, no voices. Ithara was exactly what she appeared to be, a small, underfed Omega in a thin cloak, standing in a frozen clearing 4 days into the wilderness. She did not dodge. She did not run. She dropped to the ground and rolled sideways, a movement so mundane, so graceless, that Fenrath overshot her by 10 feet, his claws catching nothing but snow. He spun, snarling, and came at her again. But here is what Fenrath did not understand about Ithara, and what the world is only now learning. She had spent her entire life being underestimated. Every day, every hour. A lifetime of being stepped over, spoken through, treated as furniture, and in that lifetime of invisibility, she had watched. She had studied. She knew how wolves fought not from training, but from observation. She knew that a wolf mid-lunge cannot change direction. She knew that rage narrows vision. She knew that a starving, sleep-deprived, half-mad alpha who had not eaten properly in 4 days was fast but fragile. She did not fight him. She exhausted him. Every lunge, she sidestepped. Every swipe, she ducked. She led him through the clearing over roots, around rocks, across patches of ice, letting his own fury do the work. He was faster. He was stronger. He was the most powerful wolf in the territory. But power without precision is just noise. And Fenrath had spent so many years relying on fear that he had forgotten how to fight someone who simply was not afraid. She tripped once. Her ankle caught a buried root and she went down hard, her palms slapping against the frozen ground. Fenrath lunged, his claws catching the edge of her cloak and tearing it from her shoulders. For 1 terrible second, she was pinned his weight-bearing down, his breath hot and rank against her neck. But his hands were shaking. His muscles were seizing from the cold, and the exertion, and the 4 days of madness. She twisted sideways, slipped out from under him the way water slips through a fist, and rolled 3 paces away. He tried to follow. His right leg buckled. He caught himself, rose, tried again. She kept moving, always just out of reach, always just ahead, not running that would trigger his chase instinct and give him a second wind. Walking, circling, making him work for every step while she conserved what little energy she had. After 20 minutes of lunging, missing, crashing, scrambling, roaring, Fenrath collapsed. His legs gave out, his body, pushed beyond its reserves, simply quit. He lay in the snow, chest heaving, breath coming in ragged, wet gasps, and for the first time, Ithara saw what she had come to see. Fear, not anger, not defiance, fear. The primal animal terror of a creature that has realized, at last, that it is not the most dangerous thing in the forest. "What are you?" he whispered. "I'm an Omega," Ithara said. "From Ashenmere. My mother washed clothes. My father died in your conscription raids when I was 6. I never learned to fight. I never trained with weapons. I can't read well. My wolf is small and brown and unremarkable." She crouched beside him, close enough to touch. "I am everything you taught this kingdom to ignore. And that is exactly why you never saw me coming." Fenrath did not die in that clearing. That would have been a kindness, and this story has none left to give. What happened instead was this. As Ithara crouched beside the fallen Alpha King, the forest around them began to fill. Not with soldiers, not with warriors, with women. They came from the trees, dozens of them, she-wolves of every rank and age, wrapped in furs, their breath making clouds in the frozen air. Some carried torches, some carried nothing. They arrived in silence, forming a wide circle around the clearing, and stood in the snow with the terrible patience of a jury that has already reached its verdict. Ithra recognized some of them, others she did not, but she understood immediately what had happened. The curse, the truth she had released in the tribunal square had not stayed within the walls of Valdrek. It had spread. Like fire through dry grass, like a howl carried on the wind, the memories of those 7 women had poured outward, reaching every pack, every settlement, every isolated homestead in the territory. Women who had suffered similar fates at the hands of similar men. Women who had been told their pain was private. Women who had been instructed their entire lives that silence was safety. They had come, not to fight, not to kill, to witness. Because Ithara had not cursed Fenrath to die. She had cursed him to be known, and now he was known. Fully, finally, irreversibly. Fenrath saw the circle of women, and something happened to his face that was worse than any wound Ithra could have inflicted. The arrogance didn't collapse, it dissolved, like salt in water. There was nothing underneath it. No remorse, no humanity, just nothing. A hollow space where a person should have been. "You can't do this," he said, but the words had no force. They were the words of a child who has been told that the game is over, not the words of a king. I am the Alpha, the bloodline. The Greymore line goes back 17 generations. You cannot simply... "We can," said a voice from the circle. It belonged to an older woman with a jagged scar running from her ear to her collarbone. She stepped forward. "My name is Dagny. My daughter was Solène." Another voice. "My name is Frey. My sister was Anakin." Another. "My name is Kara. I served in the Alpha's household for 9 years. I saw what he did to Liel." One by one, the women in the circle spoke. Not accusations, not pleas, just names, connections, proof that the disappeared had not in fact disappeared, that every erased woman had left a wound in someone who remembered. The testimony took an hour. Fenrath lay in the snow and listened to every word, because his body would not move, and his voice had left him, and the forest held him in place, like a specimen pinned to a board. When the last woman spoke, the circle fell silent. Ithra stood. "The women of the 6 packs have heard the testimony," she said, and now her voice was not layered with 7 ghosts. It was only her voice, only Ithara. And it was enough. The Alpha King Fenrath Greymore is found guilty of 7 murders, 7 desecrations of the mate bond, and the systematic silencing of an entire kingdom. She looked down at him. "The sentence is not death." A ripple went through the circle. Even the women who had come for blood looked uncertain. "The sentence," Ithara continued, "is the one thing he feared more than dying." She knelt beside him one last time, and spoke quietly enough that only he could hear, though the women who were closest said later that the wind carried her words to them anyway, as though the forest itself wanted to eavesdrop. "You will live, Fenrath. You will live as what you truly are, an Omega, rankless, nameless, without pack, without territory, without a single wolf who will lower their eyes when you pass. You will wander, you will beg, you will know what it is to be invisible, as they were invisible, and every wolf you meet will know your face, because the curse I carry is not mine to lift. It belongs to the 7, and the 7 do not forgive. She placed her hand on his forehead. It was a gentle gesture, almost maternal. And when she pulled her hand away, the mark of the Alpha, the crescent brand that every Alpha King of Valdrek had carried since the founding of the bloodline, was gone from his skin, not burned, not cut, simply absent. As if it had never been there, Fenrath screamed, not from pain, from loss. The sound he made was not human or wolf. It was something in between a howl that had no pack to answer it, a cry that echoed through the frozen trees and came back empty. His wolf, that massive, terrifying black wolf, tried to emerge. His body convulsed, his bones cracked and shifted, but the transformation stopped halfway. Stuck, suspended between forms, he writhed in the snow, half man, half beast, fully neither. And then something unprecedented happened. His wolf left him. The women in the circle saw it, a dark shape, like smoke, like shadow, pulling away from Fenrath's body and dissipating into the frozen air. His wolf spirit, the source of his power, his rank, his identity, separated from him and chose to leave. Because a wolf spirit is not a slave, it is a partner. And Fenrath's wolf had endured enough. It had carried him through 37 years of cruelty, had been the instrument of every kill, the vessel for every act of dominance. And wolves, even the spirits that live inside men, have a threshold, a line, a place beyond which they will not follow, no matter how strong the bond. Fenrath's wolf had reached that place long ago. It had stayed out of loyalty to the bond, not to the man. And now, with the bond severed by the words of 7 dead women and 1 living one, it was free to do what it had wanted to do for years. Leave. What remained was just a man. Just a naked, scarred, shivering man lying in the snow in a forest that did not care about his name. A man without rank, without power, without even the basic dignity of fur to keep him warm. He looked smaller than anyone expected. Without his wolf, Fenrath Greymore was thin-shouldered, narrow-chested, unremarkable. The body that had terrorized a kingdom was, stripped of its spiritual armor, merely human, merely fragile, merely old before its time. He tried to stand, he fell. He tried to speak. His voice came out as a whisper, thin, reedy, the voice of someone who has never been listened to and knows they never will be. "Please," he said, and the word was so foreign in his mouth that it sounded like a different language. Ithara turned away from him. She faced the circle of women. "Let him go," she said. "Do not kill him. Do not imprison him. Just let him go." And they did. The circle opened, a gap in the ring of women and torches, leading into the dark forest, an exit, a banishment. Fenrath crawled through it, on his hands and knees, in the snow, without his wolf, without his crown, without even the ability to shift and run on 4 legs, as every wolf-born creature was meant to. The women watched him crawl. They did not jeer. They did not spit. They did not throw stones. That would have given him something, a grievance, a narrative, a reason to believe he was persecuted rather than punished. Instead, they gave him nothing. They watched with the flat, patient eyes of wolves who have finally stopped fearing the thing that once controlled them. And Fenrath, crawling through that silence, understood at last what he had done to 7 women. He understood what it meant to move through a world that simply did not care if you lived or died. He crawled into the darkness, and the forest swallowed him, and the women watched until even his shadow was gone. Then Dagny Solene's mother, who had held her composure through the entire ordeal, with a stillness that frightened even Ithara, sat down in the snow and wept. She wept for 20 minutes. No one interrupted her. When she was done, she stood, wiped her face with the back of her hand, and said, "Right, what now?" It was the most important question anyone had asked in the kingdom of Valdrek in 12 years. 3 weeks later, a traveling merchant arrived at the gates of Valdrek with a strange report. He had passed through the eastern lowlands flat, desolate country where the poorest of the poor scratched out livings from frozen soil, and had seen a man on the road, a beggar, skeletal, wild-eyed, with blistered feet and no shoes, and a voice that could barely form words. The man had tried to tell the merchant his name. I was. But each time he tried to say Fenrath or Greymore or Alpha or King, the words turned to ash in his mouth. Literally. Gray dust fell from his lips like dead moths. He could not say his own name. He could not claim his own history. He had been erased from his own story, just as he had erased 7 women from theirs. The symmetry was so perfect it almost felt like mercy. Almost. But mercy would have included an ending, and this curse had none. It would follow him through every village, every road, every frozen mile of whatever remained of his life. He would approach strangers and try to explain who he had been, and the words would die before they left his mouth, and the strangers would see only a madman spitting dust and speaking in broken half-sentences about a kingdom they had never heard of. The merchant had given him bread. The man had eaten it on his knees, weeping, not from gratitude, from the humiliation of needing charity from someone who did not even know enough about him to hate him. "Did he die?" the gatekeeper asked the merchant. "Don't know," the merchant said. "When I left him, he was walking east, toward nothing. There's nothing east of there but ice and open sky." The gatekeeper nodded and recorded the sighting in the border log. Under identity, he wrote, "Unknown male. No pack, no rank, no wolf." And that was the last anyone ever heard of the thing that had once been Fenrath Greymore. As for Ithara, she returned to Valdrek, but she did not stay. She sat with the council for one meeting long enough to ensure that Moth and Dagny and the other women had seats at the table, and then she left. Grail found her at the northern gate again. The same gate, the same thin cloak. "Where?" he asked. "Ashenmere," she said. "I want to go home. You could be Alpha here. You could lead." She considered this. Truly considered it the way you consider a path before choosing a different one. "I don't want to lead a kingdom that needed a miracle to do the right thing," she said. "They didn't need me, Grail. They needed to open their mouths. And now that they have, they don't need a savior. They need practice." Grail was quiet for a long time. Snow gathered on his shoulders. Finally, he said, "The council voted to name the new meeting hall after you. The Hall of Ithara." She laughed. A real laugh, not the strategic, performative sound she had used in the square, but the surprised, involuntary laugh of someone who has heard something genuinely absurd. "Tell them to name it after Moth," she said. "Moth has been watching this kingdom longer than I've been alive. She earned that hall. I just kicked open a door." She left. The walk to Ashenmere took 4 days, the same length of time it had taken her to track Fenrath through the northern forest. She walked the same roads she had walked as a child, when her mother had sent her to the river to collect water, and she had taken the long way home just to have a few extra minutes alone with the sky. The roads were the same. She was not. She arrived in her village on a gray morning, with snow dusting her cloak and her boots worn through at the soles. Ashenmere looked exactly as it always had, small, poor, tucked into a fold of the mountain like an afterthought. The houses were wood and mud. The chimneys leaked. The children were thin-legged and bright-eyed, the way children are when they have learned to find joy in things that cost nothing. Her mother was standing outside their small house, mending a fence. The fence had been broken since before Ithara left a section near the gate where the wood had rotted through, and the wind pushed it crooked every winter. Her mother had been mending it, board by board, for as long as Ithara could remember. It was never quite fixed. It was never quite abandoned. It was, Ithara realized, with a sudden tightness in her chest, the most honest metaphor for survival she had ever seen. When her mother saw Ithara, she put down her tools. She did not cry. She did not run to embrace her. She studied her daughter's face the way a healer studies a wound carefully, thoroughly, looking for damage that might not be visible on the surface. Whatever she found there seemed to satisfy her, because she nodded once and said, "You look tired." "I am." "Are you hurt?" "Not in any way that shows." Her mother considered this. "Are you staying?" "Yes." Her mother nodded again. "There's soup. It's not good soup, but it's hot." And that was it. No fanfare, no throne, no crown placed upon her brow by weeping subjects. Ithara went inside, sat at the table where she had sat as a child, and ate soup from a wooden bowl while the snow fell outside, and the fire crackled, and the world was, for the first time in her memory, quiet in a way that did not feel like fear. The soup was, as promised, not good. It was thin and undersalted, and the vegetables had been boiled past recognition. It was the best thing she had ever tasted. But here is the last thing. The thing that keeps this story from being finished, even now. On the night Ithara returned to Ashenmere, the moon goddess was full, a pale disk in the black sky, watching the earth with the indifference of a god who has seen too many wolves make the same mistakes. And on that night, in 7 different places across the Six-Pack territory, 7 different women who had no connection to each other, who lived in different settlements and belonged to different packs, woke from the same dream. In the dream, they stood in a clearing. Snow was falling. 7 women stood before them, transparent, fading, barely there. And each ghost pressed a palm to each dreamer's forehead and said the same words. "We are done now. You carry it from here." 7 women woke. 7 women sat up in the dark. 7 women touched their foreheads and felt warmth, a gentle, residual heat, like the memory of a hand that had been there a moment ago. And 7 women understood, without being told, that something had been passed to them. Not power, not vengeance, not rage, but awareness. The unshakable, bone-deep knowledge that silence is not safety, that a crown is not a right, that any wolf who uses the mate bond as a weapon is not a king, but a disease. And disease, as every healer knows, spreads. But so does the cure. Years from now, when this story is told around fires and in dens, when pups hear it for the first time and ask, "Was she real?" the elders will answer with a question of their own. Does it matter? Because here is what matters. There is a kingdom in the Iron Maw Mountains that no longer has a king. It has a council. It has omegas who speak, and betas who listen, and elders who are asked before decisions are made. It is not perfect. It is messy and loud, and sometimes the meetings last until dawn, and sometimes wolves leave angry, but no one disappears. No one is erased. No one's name is swallowed by silence. Moth sits at the head of the council table. She is 91 years old. She can barely see past her own hands. But when she speaks, the room goes quiet not from fear, but from the bone-deep understanding that a woman who was invisible for 6 decades sees things that no one else can. Dagny, Solen's mother, runs the border patrol. She reorganized it from the ground up, replacing the old system of intimidation with something radical: accountability. Every patrol wolf answers to a rotating council of pack members: farmers, healers, teachers, mothers. The wolves complained at first. Now they volunteer. And in Ashenmere, in a small house with a leaking chimney, Ithra tends a garden that has no business growing in mountain soil. She coaxes herbs from frozen ground through sheer stubbornness, and what some villagers suspect is a lingering trace of whatever power the seven lent her. She does not speak about what happened in Valdrek. When travelers arrive and recognize her name and ask for the story, she points them to Moth. She tells it better, Ithara says. She was there longer. And somewhere, on a frozen road that leads to nowhere, a man without a wolf walks east. He cannot say his name. He cannot claim his past. He exists only in the present, hungry, cold, alone, and the world treats him exactly as he treated the women who trusted him, with nothing. So the question is not, was Ithara real? The question, the one that should keep you up tonight, the one that should make your bones itch and your teeth clench, is this. How many Itheras are in your pack right now? How many small, quiet, invisible wolves are watching not because they are weak, but because they are waiting? And what happens when they stop waiting? Think about that. Really think. Because every tyrant in history believed they were untouchable. Every king who ruled through fear was certain, absolutely certain, that the people beneath them were too broken to rise. Fenrath believed it. He believed it so deeply that he never bothered to learn the names of the women he destroyed. They were beneath his attention. They were furniture. They were silence, shaped like people. And one of those silences stood up in a square full of snow and said 7 names and burned a 300-year dynasty to the ground. Not with an army, not with magic, not with a destined bloodline or a prophecy written in the stars. With memory, with witness, with the simple, devastating act of refusing to be quiet when every force in the world was designed to keep her mouth shut. What happens when the silence breaks? Because it will. It always does. The silence is not loyalty. It is not consent. It is not peace. It is pressure building, compounding, tightening like a fist around a throat and pressure. As every wolf who has survived an avalanche knows, does not build forever. It releases. And when it releases, it takes everything in its path. The only question is whether you will be standing with the women in the circle or crawling through the gap they leave behind.